Since the announcement of Microsoft 365 Copilot back in March, we've been working with fairly limited information about how Microsoft 365 Copilot is going to work, and specifically around how it's going to work with the data in your Microsoft 365 tenant in order to add value to all of the different types of business processes that it's going to be able to interact with. There has been a little bit of information that's been trickling out, and the most I think we got was a couple of weeks ago when I released this video looking at the issue of semantic indexing, which was highlighted as a tool that would help bring information into Copilot in the future. But a couple of days ago, Microsoft Mechanics released a video looking at how Microsoft 365 Copilot is going to work and how it's going to interact with your data that I think adds a lot of interesting points to this discussion, which up until now has been based kind of on best guesses around how Microsoft interacts in terms of its other technologies rather than specific information that's to do with Microsoft 365 Copilot. So let's take a look at this and watch through some of this content together.
Have you ever wanted to know how large language models work when you connect them to the data in your organization? At Microsoft, we recently demonstrated Microsoft 365 Copilot, which transforms how we work by leveraging large language models that interact with your organizational data. Copilot works alongside you. For example, in Word, Copilot can easily write an entirely new document, like a business proposal, using content from your existing files. Or in Outlook, based on content you select, Copilot can compose your email replies for you. In PowerPoint, you can transform your written content into a visually beautiful presentation with a click of a button.
I think it's interesting that each of these examples, and we have seen these examples before, but it's very clear that the user interaction is to select where that content comes from. So I think we know that there are going to be two different kind of processes that exist with Copilot, in that you're able to say, hey, grab information from X document, X presentation, X spreadsheet, and it'll be able to help you with that. But also in the background, it's going to be looking at your data and working out what the best data is to help you with X tasks that you're doing. So I do think it's interesting to highlight that we're looking at two different, perhaps similar use cases, but there's the one where there's more user interaction here, which seems to be being pushed into the Office apps, maybe a bit more than the business chat examples that we've seen, which will probably come up here as well.
In Teams, Copilot can generate meeting summaries with discussed follow-up actions. Or while using business chat in Microsoft Teams, it can help you catch up on something you may have missed, bringing together information from multiple sources to bring you up to speed.
And exactly, that's what we've just seen here. So you're asking a question and it's finding the information that you want to look at or it thinks is relevant to you. So two different kind of very similar, but two different flows when it comes to the information that you're using with Copilot.
LLMs are trained on massive amounts of public data, including books, articles, and websites, to learn language, context, and meaning.
Now, the highlight here of public data is very important because I think it's very important to Microsoft to make the distinction between that public data and the private data that you have that's part of your Microsoft 365 subscription. So the large language model, whatever it is that they're using, if they're using their own instance of GPT-4, whatever it may be, has been trained on these public data sets, or what we imagine of public data sets. I know there are some issues going on right now around copyright and how data can be used for training large language models, but generally saying it's public data, it's data that's accessible out there on the internet, it's nothing that's in your Microsoft 365 subscription.
You can interact with large language models using natural language with what's called a prompt. A prompt is typically a statement or question. When you ask a question in the prompt, the LLM generates a response based on its public data training and understanding of context. A key difference is that it only remembers the conversation while it's in that conversation. The chat history is wiped clean with each new conversation. And it won't use the knowledge from your conversations and interactions to train the model.
So that point of it won't use the interactions to train the model. that's kind of been said in this video in almost like a blanket term of if you're using an AI that's relying on a large language model, then your prompt isn't going to be used to train the model. And that simply isn't true on a broad basis. We know, for example, that if you're using ChatGPT, up until fairly recently, the prompts that were being used to interact with ChatGPT could be used to train the model. And I think it's still the case that if you don't turn your chat history off in ChatGPT, that your prompts still can be used to train the model. So I do think there's an important distinction here of how your data is used, that you're interacting with whatever AI system it is, depends on the privacy statements of that AI system versus it being kind of a blanket standard that if you're interacting with AI, they're not using those interactions to train their models.
Copilot has several core components. First off are the large language models hosted in the Microsoft Cloud via the Azure OpenAI service. To be clear, Copilot is not calling the public OpenAI service that powers ChatGPT. Microsoft 365 Copilot uses its own private instances of the large language models.
And a couple of weeks ago, I put out a video that kind of highlighted this issue. I looked at the terms of use that existed for the Azure OpenAI service and highlighted the fact that the Azure OpenAI service doesn't rely upon OpenAI's their instances of the LLMs, that Microsoft has its own instances of those LLMs. So if you're using the Azure OpenAI service as it stands, the data that you're throwing into that service never leaves Azure. And I hypothesized at that point that this was going to be the framework on which Microsoft 365 Copilot is based. So your data is never leaving Microsoft, it's never leaving Azure. And I think from what has been said here, that hypothesis of that connection is confirmed.
Next, Microsoft 365 Copilot has a powerful orchestration engine that I'll explain in a moment. Copilot capabilities are surfaced in and work with Microsoft 365 apps. Microsoft Search is used for information retrieval to feed prompts.
Now, I think that's interesting that we're talking about Microsoft Search and we're not just talking about the Microsoft Graph, because of the video, the announcement that was made, I think, a week or two ago, that talked about semantic indexing. Semantic indexing was a layer being put on top of search, really, to enhance the way that search works within your organization with AI. And the point was made that this was kind of a foundational tool that was going to allow organizations to get better prepared for Copilot. And now I think it's clear what is meant by that, of these enhancements that you can potentially make to search with other tools that might be available in different license tiers. I believe, if I remember correctly, that at that point we learned that those capabilities would be available in Enterprise E3 and Enterprise E5. So potentially there's more search tools that are available if you have a properly licensed enterprise subscription than if you're just using something like Business Standard or Business Premium.
Like I did in the example before, where information I provided in my prompt was used to help generate an answer. Then the Microsoft Graph, which has long been foundational to Microsoft 365, includes additional information about the relationships and activities over your organization's data. The Copilot system respects per-user access permissions to any content and graph information it retrieves. This is important because Microsoft 365 Copilot will only generate responses based on information that you have explicit permission to access.
And this is something I've been looking at over the last couple of weeks and is featured in the video that I will be putting out about governance of there's this issue of, yeah, sure, what you have access to in Graph is what you have access to, or what Copilot has access to on your behalf. But that means that we maybe need to rethink what people have access to depending on the culture of an organization. You don't want cultures of permissiveness or unnecessary burdens to get information to have an impact that creates unforeseen circumstances around using AI. And I think that's something that really is going to come down to governance, as in how many organizations does all of the data someone has access to really completely represent exactly what they need to do their exact job at this time. And Copilot is maybe going to help us to expose some of those weaknesses in areas of permissions and governance and so on and so forth that will need to be spring cleaned a little to make Copilot work exactly how you want it to.
Additionally, Microsoft 365 has its own default prompt with responsible rules for interaction. This includes things like where to search to find the right information for a prompt. For example, calling the Microsoft Graph to gain more context, like your recent documents or messages. Also, the style and tone of the response, including things like being informative for style and positive for tone, as well as different approaches that Copilot can take to gather information for the prompt. For example, it can choose to iterate on a few different searches until there's enough information for it to generate a good response. Copilot knows how it should cite its sources, and of course, respects responsible AI practices, such as ensuring harmful content is not included in generated responses.
I wonder if businesses will be able to add to or perhaps tailor this default prompt in some way so that you can edit your experience. I think this is interesting because it kind of frames what type of response you're going to get, but perhaps different organizations want to include different things or exclude different things from the types of responses they might get. So it'll be interesting to see if there's some framework that's created to allow an organization to tailor the defaults that they get from Copilot.
Importantly, this default prompt gets appended to your prompt whenever you interact with Copilot. The Microsoft 365 Copilot Orchestrator combines the default prompt with your prompt, plus additional information it's gathered, and will form one long prompt to present to the LLM in order to generate a response. Now let's go back to the example you saw earlier in Microsoft Teams where a user asked, "Did anything happen yesterday with Fabricam?" Copilot didn't just send that question or prompt directly to the large language model. Instead, Copilot knew that it needed more knowledge and context, so using clues from the user's question, like Fabricam, it inferred that it needed to search for content sources private to the organization. The Copilot Orchestrator searched the Microsoft Graph for activities, ensuring it respected the user's permissions and access to information, in this case, the user Kat. It found the email thread from Mona that Kat received, activities in the project checklist and March planning presentation, which are files that Kat had access to, as well as the sharing action where the final contract was sent to Fabricam for review. Again, where Kat would have been part of the share activity. And Copilot cited each source of information so Kat could easily validate the response.
I think what this confirms is that the kind of hypothesized workflow as to how Copilot is going to work is exactly how it does work. You have access to certain things within your tenant. Copilot respects that. It respects your user context and gives you a response based on throwing out some of that content to the LLM, getting the LLM to give you a neat response to it, and then bringing that response and presenting it wherever you're working.
These are all individual steps that Kat could have done manually, like searching her inbox for emails for Mona, looking at recent project file activities in SharePoint, or reading the sharing notifications sent to Fabricam for the contract. Copilot removed the tediousness of performing these steps manually and formulated a natural, easy-to-follow, and concise response in a single step.
I wonder if that is actually true, though. Like, the point being made is she could have done this herself, and that's true, she could have done this herself, but I feel like in a lot of cases the human inclination is to find a certain level of information and feel like you found the information. So you read the last email, you read the last document, you're not necessarily beyond that unless that email, unless that correspondence prompts you to look for something else. You're not necessarily getting all of that context. So if there was another document elsewhere in the organization that you have access to that contradicts what you're looking at in the response that you're looking at there, then you're not necessarily going to seek that out. Whereas because Copilot is a computer system that can deal with huge amounts of data, much more data than a single human being can, it's able to look at everything that you have access to and to synthesize a good response. So I wonder if actually that's going to be more powerful than just going out and doing the task yourself. I think there's a strong likelihood that in a lot of situations and for a lot of different workers, that could probably be the case.
So that's how Business Chat with Copilot works. Now, in the examples I showed you earlier, you also saw how Microsoft 365 Copilot can help save you time in the apps you're working in by generating content. In fact, let's go back to the Copilot in Word example to explain how that worked. Microsoft 365 Copilot can help generate a draft proposal by using content you've been working on, for example, in OneNote or other documents that you have access to, like Word or PowerPoint files. Here, we combine the large language model's training on how a proposal document is structured and written with Microsoft 365 Copilot orchestration, which scans and takes relevant inputs from additional documents you've selected, adding the information to the prompt. The LLM is then able to generate an entirely new proposal document with the additional information from those files, providing a first draft that you can use to save time.
And again, we have the point of this is a first draft. I don't know if you saw in the example earlier, there was the added text of this is an AI response and it may be wrong. I'm paraphrasing there. So it continues to be the case that Microsoft is focusing on these are tools that create a first draft. They are not tools that create a final product. And I think that's very important, both to the quality of what you're getting. You want to promise low and deliver high, and I think that's what they're trying to do here. But also, they don't want to get into the business of providing fodder for those people who are saying this is the AI apocalypse, all of our jobs are going to disappear, by focusing on the fact that this may be wrong, this requires human interaction, this is a co-pilot for a human, not a replacement. They're making sure that their tools aren't part of that conversation right now.
And just like with the Business Chat example, the important thing to remember here is that the enterprise data used to generate informed responses is only present as part of a prompt to the large language model. These prompts are not retained by the large language models, nor used to train them, and all retrieved information is based on the individual data access and permissions you have while using Copilot. So hopefully that explains how Copilot capabilities in Microsoft 365 work.
So what have we learned there? Well, I think we've learned a little bit more about how Microsoft 365 Copilot works, and what we've learned aligns with some of the guesses that we've been able to make regarding how other parts of Microsoft 365 learn already. It's very interesting to be able to see exactly what the workflow is, that when you ask Copilot for something, there's all of those steps that are going on in the background to make sure that you get a good response, to make sure that you're being respectful of data security, to make sure that it's aligning with the type of response that Microsoft wants to give. But I will think it's interesting to learn whether organizations have any capability to intervene in that and to change those default prompts in some way to tailor the type of response that you get for your organization differently than what the Microsoft default would be. Now, we have to remember this video was put out a week before Microsoft Build, and we can probably expect that we're going to get more information about Copilot at Build, and maybe a bit more technical information about how some of these things are actually going to work. There was definitely technical information there, but I would be interested, for example, as to what happens with logging of prompts. Like, is there complete logging of what Microsoft is composing as a prompt in the background so that you can completely understand what got sent over to the LLM to get response X, based on what they're saying about expanding those prompts? It sounds like there's going to be a lot of data flying around to do this. So how feasible it will be to actually hold on to all that information for a very long period of time, I don't know, but I can imagine there would be some organizations where if they've had a document that's been created by AI, they would want the life of the prompt that created that document to be exactly the same as the life of the document itself. So it'll be interesting to learn things like that about how this is going to work. But I think what this reinforces is this idea that where data lives and who has access to what is going to be all the more important to the efficacy of these types of tools. You can only gain advantage from your AI tool if the AI tool is looking at information that is entirely relevant to whatever it is that you're trying to do. And so if you don't have access to that information, either because of the culture of your organization, and that comes into that video that I talked about that I made around governance that will be coming out, or because your data doesn't live in Microsoft 365, and that rolls into that video that I already mentioned and have released around whether your data is ready for Copilot, you may run into some problems with this. So I think that what we're going to see is a real impetus to make sure that your users can see the right data, and we're maximizing what data Microsoft 365 and the Microsoft Graph has access to. And I'm sure we'll be seeing more information about that in the coming weeks. I think this is really exciting. I'm looking forward to being able to, at some point in the future, play with Copilot and understand its exact capabilities. But the more that I see of this, the more excited I am about it, and the more that I think this is really going to have very positive impacts in a lot of workplaces, because there just are right now so many problems that people run into with the sheer weight of data that they've got. They get too many emails, they've got too many documents, they're not sure exactly where X is or where to find Y. They end up spending their time searching for stuff or recreating information rather than just adding value. And we all have a lot to do. We're all busier than we should be, I think. And so to be able to get a tool that helps us to maybe take a minute to reflect and to just add value, to get some new ideas, some new thoughts in our mind, rather than just continually running to keep pace, I think that's going to be valuable to so many people, and I think that's what Copilot is going to enable us to do. So the links to this video and other information related to the announcements we've talked about there will be in the description below. I do hope this has been a useful analysis of Microsoft's video for you and has added value, and I will keep updating on issues like this. So until next time, bye bye.